Bismillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to this one-off episode with Cage. We were talking about it amongst the team members, and we felt like it was important for us to really think about making some kind of intervention around George Floyd's execution by the police in the US. Especially because, when we think about our work at Cage, when we think about the whole notion of securitization, then, we know that we can't decouple that from the history of racist violence that we've seen throughout history. So we know that policies that are enacted in the war on terror, they didn't just simply come out of the air. It wasn't just like 9/11 happened and all of a sudden there were all of these extremely repressive policies throughout the world that were being used as part of surveilling Muslims. That surveillance was built on a much older and larger architecture of racism and racist profiling, much of which originated during the period of colonization, even before then within Europe. But I mean, that's a longer history. But what we want to talk about today, and really this is kind of concentrating on giving some ideas about the kind of books that we can read to help educate ourselves a bit more so that we're more familiar with these ideas, is that there is a specific form of racism that is taking place in America still to this day, that has never really gone away, that is embedded in the structures and the institutions of society, as well as proliferating among the general public too. And in order to understand that, we do need to think a little bit more deeply about, where all of this came from. And so I'm just going to share some books that I've read. I'm not saying this is the definitive list of books on racism in America, or on America, that we should all be reading. What I'm saying is that here are books that I've personally benefited from in terms of helping to develop my own thinking, my own understanding about how racism works, and kind of how I've tried to draw lessons from that in the work that I do, trying to represent people who are caught up in the global war on terror. But really, like, in order to understand one, you have to understand the other. You have to understand how racism in America operates. So the first book I want to highlight is this one. This is called Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. It's it's a tome of a book. It's very, very dense, but extremely important. The reason I want to start with this book is what Ibram does so well is that he takes racism at its narrative level. He looks at how the ideas that percolated deep in history came to be embedded within the discourse on racism in America, how they became embedded within the very constitution of America itself. That this isn't something that you can just simply pass off and say, well, that was in the past. That actually the way that America has developed as a society is really based on its founding roots. And, he goes into a great deal of depth. And, I was thinking about which book to start with. And of course, the obvious place to start is usually slavery. And definitely there's many books on that you can read. Somebody stole my copy of Sylviane Diouf's The Servants of Allah, which is about the experience of Muslims who were transported to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. It's an excellent book. You should definitely pick that up. So I can't show you that one. But then you've got other books like this. Bilali Muhammad, who was a Muslim who still tried and attempted to hold on to his faith despite being a slave in antebellum Georgia in America. So there's a lot of content out there, of course, that we should be reading around the history of slavery. There's some very good fiction as well. Yad Jassi's Homegoing, which I have somewhere. But yeah, that's that part of the history. And I think the transatlantic slave trade is something that people generally associate with racism in America. So it's something that's commonly known. People will talk about it, will say, yes, that was a terrible thing that happened in the past. But what happens after that? You know, it's not just a case that there was slavery and then there wasn't slavery, and then some people will know about Jim Crow, and then after Jim Crow, everything was fine. That's a very kind of liberal narrative around how racism works, and that after Jim Crow, it's just like pockets of racism, really. To really connect the dots, we have to start at slavery for sure, but then we need to see how the law itself and the way that America was founded, it really ran as tendrils. That slavery, that those policies around slavery ran as tendrils through the way that America as a society that was constituted was then formulated and then reinforced, both in its legal structures as well as its political structures. So I think Ibram Kendi does an amazing job of setting the tone for where that discourse really emerges from. And I think like a lot of attention should be paid to the work that he's doing. There's some other really important books I just thought of that I think that you should think about. Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, but also W.B. Du Bois is The Souls of Black Folk. He was a black intellectual, Du Bois, who really was one of the early critics of racism, especially kind of within the black community itself. He was very critical of black liberals, especially like the black bourgeoisie. It's interesting because Ibram Kendi has some critiques of Du Bois himself, which I think are really worth thinking about and going through. So there's a lot of content out there in relation to that whole period that we really need to be thinking about, especially that early period. But what I really want to focus on is that legal structure, that emerges where it's not technically a form of slavery, but de facto, in the way that everything operates, you have this entrenched discrimination that goes through society. And this book that I read last year really, it was a massive eye opener for me. It's called The Color of Law: A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. So that's the second book that I really want to focus on, and it's written by Richard Rothstein. And it's really a meticulous in its presentation of kind of the legal mechanisms that were used to systematically deny African Americans opportunities to escape poverty. So he doesn't just show how schools were racially segregated. I think many people know about that. But even things like the housing market, for example, or iniquitous mortgage arrangements, there were all of these ways in which American society was able to sideline black people, to ghettoize them into different areas by redlining certain districts that they weren't allowed to live outside of. Now, technically, they did all of this through the law. So there wasn't anything illegal about it, but of course it was completely immoral. But when we then think about, well, why do black people live in these ghettos and whatever else, you have, particularly kind of from people of color who have made it for themselves, they'll come up with these very privileged arguments about black people. Well, why do they all live together in certain areas? Well, it's because they were never allowed to live anywhere else. There was a formal structure in place that denied them the ability to live, in places where they could have had more opportunities. And of course, what came with that if you lived in a certain area, then you were denied access to good schooling. You were denied access to decent housing. You were denied access to all sorts of things. If you wanted to go and get a mortgage, you were denied that as well because of the area that you lived in. And so it self-perpetuates. That it wasn't just that they were kind of sectioned off into certain areas. is that it affected that just living there, being segregated like that, affected every single part of their lives. And it's fascinating that when you read into the book, you see that when, say, for example, a middle-class black family was finally able to maybe move into an area that was slightly more affluent, that actually all of the white neighbors of that community, of that area, would band together in order to try and make life impossible for that person. They would often go to the estate agents directly to try and stop them from selling the house to a black family. There were all of these things taking place, right? And so again, when we think about the geography, when we think about the human geography of where people are located, how they're living their lives, how the system and the structure denied them for decades and decades the possibility of entering into society on their own terms, you can see when we talk about structural racism, how the structures were put together to deny people their rights. Moving on to the next book that I have in my list of 10. Everyone's going to be familiar with the Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. He was one of the great civil rights activists of his era. I think it's really interesting because Martin Luther King Jr. is often presented, especially by kind of like quietists and pacifists, as completely passive in his approach. So they use his non-violence as a way of promoting quietism, as a way of promoting this idea that he didn't challenge the state in a strong way, and that is actually a complete misreading of his history and legacy. Yes, of course, he was on the non-violent end of the spectrum. He built his own campaign, his own activism around that. He was very much tied to it, but it didn't mean that he was passive. It didn't mean that he wasn't willing to take risks. It didn't mean that he didn't believe in disobeying unjust laws, which isn't an act of passivity. And I think his letters from a Birmingham jail in particular are so outstanding in the way he describes this conscience that we're all supposed to have, that when we see these unjust laws, when we see what is going on to society and how it so systematically harms and drains the life out of those who are being affected by it, that the duty in that circumstance is to disobey laws that are so violent in the way that they're constructed. And actually, there's this book, which I didn't include in my list of 10, but it's still very important. It's called A More Beautiful and Terrible History: The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History by Jean Theo Harris. What I really like about this book a lot is Jean Theo Harris, effectively says that liberals, they've tried to co-opt that civil rights history to pacify people, that, to show that, well, we were always in support of Martin Luther King. We were always in support of the civil rights movement. And she unpicks that. And what she effectively shows is that even while they were making platitudes towards these slain individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., you still had his wife, Coretta Scott King, being surveilled and followed by the FBI, having her life made difficult for her by the FBI. And so you have this idea that, now in contemporary times, we're looking back, we're trying to own the legacy and the history of these people. If you look at Muhammad Ali and his funeral, the way that people were trying to co-opt that history and that legacy of his to make him out as if he was some kind of university loved individual. That wasn't the case. In fact, if anything, American society universally reviled him, except amongst like radical whites and people of color. So it's important that we understand the history within the context that it took place, not through 2020 revisionist lenses. Okay, that's not going to help us. It doesn't help us to understand what was going on then through the eyes of how people, wish to view that history now. And it's really important that we don't allow liberals to just simply get away with saying, well, we were always against these laws. We were always in support of Martin Luther King. We were always in support of Malcolm X. That's not true. That's not what happened at all. And speaking of Malcolm X, that's the next book. So the Autobiography of Malcolm X. I mean, it's one of the books that I think all of us have or should have, if we don't already. It's to describe it as life-changing. I still don't think gives it enough credit. I'm very upset, actually, that I have this copy, and the only reason I'm upset about that is because the copy that I had over many years made numerous annotations and comments and written a great deal inside, was borrowed by somebody and never returned. So I'm sharing that with you. It's completely got nothing to do with this presentation, other than the fact that it's upsetting for me. But still, all the same, it's I think everyone should have a copy of it. I think one of the reasons why the Autobiography of Malcolm X is so compelling is because he writes in a way that really captures all of those innermost anxieties that I think most of us have about living in the West, especially as people of color. And of course, for Black people in particular, especially Black people who live in America, because there is this constant desire to be seen, to be validated, to be part of the wider society. Nobody wants to live their life in a way that you feel exceptionalized, that you feel surveilled, that you feel as if every single moment of your life is something that you have to struggle with. And to see this martyr, Malcolm X, to see him describe the transformations that he goes through, it really enlightens your heart in ways that I think very, very few books can. Out of, I guess, all of the books that I'm mentioning today, it's definitely amongst the must reads. If you don't have a copy of this book, if you haven't read the autobiography yet, it's so necessary because of like this intimate conversation that he's having with us about his own life. But you'll see parts of yourself constantly throughout, even if you don't recognize the formal structure of it. Just sometimes you'll read a snippet and you'll think, yeah, I feel that. I know exactly what that feels like. I felt that pain before. And so there is a beauty to it that I think is really quite exceptional. The next book in my list is Assata, an autobiography by Assata Shakur. As it says at the top, the FBI's most wanted woman. It's a profound book about one of the Black Liberation Army, a truly amazing individual who managed to escape her imprisonment in the end, who really fought a great deal for the rights of others. When you look at the history of the Black Panthers, when you look at the history of these civil rights figures and the way in which they were trying to stand up, so you've got Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were kind of contemporaries for one another. You also have, I haven't mentioned him yet actually, but for those of you who haven't read any James Baldwin, James Baldwin should be in all of your lists as well of reading material. He's such an incredible writer. But with Assata Shakur, what you get is like the next stage after Malcolm. She comes along at the same period as the Black Panther Party. That she's a member. She's fighting for the rights of others. They have this attitude, this absolutely amazing attitude at a time that nobody's thinking along those lines. They're standing there with guns, with rifles, ready to defend themselves against police brutality. They're sending the message that we're not going to take this. We're not going to take anything from you anymore. We are here to defend our lives. And not because they just felt like being radical for the sake of being radical. You have to look at the history. You have to understand which moment she's emerging from. And the serious intellectual work that has gone into their understanding of what moment they're in, where they are, how they've come to be there. And I think it's one of the aspects that is often overlooked with the Black Panther Party, that they're seen as these kind of revolutionaries. But you know, for people who haven't read into them, who haven't read about their legacy in detail, who haven't read their own works, what they miss is how well thought through they were, how deliberate they were in many of the things that they were doing, especially in the early years of their work, before the FBI started to try and destabilize them. There's actually, one book that I wanted to mention before I go back to the Black Panthers, because I just realized I forgot about it. It's not in my list of 10, but for younger readers who might not necessarily be able to pick up the Autobiography of Malcolm X, his daughter Ilyasa Shabazz, she wrote this book. It's called X, a novel. And this, especially the first part of the Autobiography of Malcolm X, it does an amazing job of making that part of his story very, very accessible to younger readers. And when I mean younger readers, I would still suggest that this is a book for teenage readers rather than younger than that, because there's still some difficult content in there for them. But I just wanted to raise it because I don't often talk about material for children. And I feel like, of course, you know, our children should be engaging with these works as well in different ways. And Ilyas Shabazz, she wrote that, but she also wrote another book which my son has taken from me, so I don't have a copy of it in my room right now. But it's called Betty Before Shabazz, which is about her mother and her mother's journey into her life as an activist, as somebody who defended the rights of Black people. And that's really an incredible tale about her mother's life, and that's actually for younger readers as well. So X by Ilyas Shabazz, probably for teenagers, really focuses on Malcolm X. Betty Before Shabazz, I gave it to my 8-year-old. He was still 8 when he read it, and he really enjoyed it a lot. It was very emotional for him. He actually cried while he was reading it, because there was some difficult content in there, but I still feel like he was ready to read that. So just, you know, I don't often talk about children's fiction, but both of those were excellent books. So I highly recommend them. So sorry, coming back to the Black Panther Party after that little segue. This book I actually just finished yesterday, but I included it in my list of 10 because I really benefited from it a great deal, and I just wrote a review of it on my Instagram. It's called Black Against Empire: The History and Politics of the Black Panther Party. So Joshua Bloom and Waldo Martin, they do some of the most extensive work in looking at all of the biographies and autobiographies that were written by Black Panther Party members, doing extensive interviews with those who are still alive or that they were able to contact, looking at FBI material, and really going through so much archival material about them in order to produce what is, I mean, it is a thick book. It's not a, you know, a light read. You're talking about, you know, almost 500 pages. But I think, despite some of the reservations that I had with, you know, some of the narrative that they were presenting about the Black Panthers, which I think is a misreading of their history, maybe. Generally speaking, I think it was an excellent account. If you want to read one book that helps you to understand what their life and legacy is, because, you know, they are a moment. They are a moment that come along and say that we've had enough, and we are going to stand up for ourselves, and we are going to take our rights. And like, for example, there's this amazing moment that comes in the book where, you know, Huey Newton, one of the founders, a police officer stops him, and he says, look, and he's trying to like hassle Huey Newton a little bit. I think this is like 1969 that this is happening in the summer. And Newton says to him, I've got my rifle here. If you're going to arrest me because I've done something wrong, then I'll come peacefully, but you have to arrest me. But if you're just harassing me and you're trying to brutalize me, then I have my rifle here and I will defend myself at all costs. So they were so smart about the way they went about their business. They understood where the law was. They understood what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do and what they weren't going to take. And the reason why that they were carrying these guns was because they knew that the police were constantly trying to take advantage of them. What's really sad about this, of course, is that, you know, and what's well documented within the book is the mendacious way in which the FBI specifically went about its work to destabilize them and demobilize them. And that's a real lesson for us in so many ways as we try and build various activist networks, as we try to cooperate with different groups, how divisions are exploited between various groups that are trying to fight against the violence of a state, that are trying to push back against the structures of the state, that are trying to say, we've had enough and we want justice for all. So when we think about how those divisions are exploited, it's important for us to think about the ways in which the Black Panthers operated. I wrote an academic journal piece a few years ago that really focused on the tactics of repression that were used against the Black Panthers. And what's really interesting was to see that actually not just Cage, but a number of different kind of activist groups within the UK right now, nearly every single one of those repressive tactics have been used. And so we should be aware of that. We should be aware of what's going on. We should be aware of how the state tries to delegitimize our work in order that we can actually try and build some resilience within our own organizations against those tactics. The next book is this one. Oops, sorry. It's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. The subtitle is Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And you know, Michelle Alexander, this book is amazing. She talks about the racial caste system. And I think that's really appropriate way of describing what the book is about. What she's showing us is how, particularly since the war on drugs, which started with in the Nixon era. Am I right? I think so. Or Reagan era. And she goes through how systematically Black people in particular, Black men in particular, have become subject to the structures of law that are not there to really produce a safe society. They're there specifically to over-incarcerate. And this book, when you read it alongside a documentary that was produced by Ava DuVernay on Netflix, it's called 13th, you'll really see how the notion that somehow slavery was something in the past is complete and utter nonsense. When you look at the way that the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution is used, where the Constitution specifically says that you cannot enslave anybody except for those who have been convicted of a crime, right? That's a paraphrasing of what the 13th Amendment says. And so you realize that, oh, well, hold on a second, they're making an exception for prisoners here. And then when you realize they're making an exception for prisoners in terms of the way in which they can be treated by society, and then you see that there is a mass incarceration taking place, and then you couple that with private companies turning to private prisons and saying, you know, we want to make use of your prison labor, right? So now private companies are getting slave labor from private prisons. There is a structure here that effectively turns human beings into modern day slaves. It's so important that we don't just simply overlook that. if you want to see something really troubling around this, I really recommend you Google the Angola State Rodeo. It's very hard to watch this because, I mean, it's been about 10 years since colleagues of mine in America highlighted it to me, and I had no idea that this thing existed. That every single year, not just Angola State Prison, but a number of other prisons as well, they invite around 20,000 people, and predominantly white people, to watch an exhibition. So it's a ticketed event. You have popcorn and burgers and, you know, hot dogs and drinks being sold at these things. People are coming there as a sporting occasion. And what is it? It's prisoners being placed in an arena where their lives are being put at risk by effectively taking part in games with bulls, with raging bulls. So, for example, they've got a game called Prison Poker, where the 4 prisoners will be sat at a table and a ball is released into the stadium, and the last person still sitting on his chair will get a reward. Now, some people will say, well, the prisoners choose to do this. They're not being forced, they're not being coerced into it. But when you understand that prison itself is a coercive environment, that prison guards have so much of an ability to really make the life of prisoners extremely difficult if they do not cooperate, if they do not do what they're being asked, that their privileges can be taken away, that they can be put in isolation, that you know that the whole structure can coerce them to do these things. And there's plenty of evidence that that is taking place. And so, you know, I think that it's really important that we don't just take simplistic views towards the criminal justice system, that we don't just look at it and say, oh, right, like they're prisoners, they must have done something wrong, so they deserve to be there. The entire architecture of the way that US imprisonment works, the way that convictions work, the way that charges work, the way that police work, is inherently racialized. And so, as it stands, there cannot be anything other than a call for abolishing the system. Really, like, there's no two ways about it. And I think the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book, really helps to set the platform to make that case. The next book, in some ways, is connected. Sorry, hold on a second. Actually, yeah, there's another child's book that I wanted to mention at this point. It's not connected to the 10, but it's called Missing Daddy by Mariam Kaba. I mean, it's very sad that this book needed to be written in the first place. It's a children's book, literally about how to help you understand Black men being held in systems of mass incarceration. Like, you have pages like this, for example. Sometimes my classmates laugh and make fun. They say, you know your daddy's a criminal, so that makes you one. It's heartbreaking that a book like this is needed, but there are so many Black men who have been forced into a system of mass incarceration that Mariam Kaba, you know, felt the need to produce something like this for children who have lost their fathers. Sometimes, you know, on 3 strike offenses, you know, something that Michelle Alexander goes through again, for petty crimes, that when you're caught and convicted 3 times, you are sent to life in prison. That is a disgrace beyond anything that we can possibly imagine. And oftentimes, I'm not saying it happens every time, but often, those minor offenses are because people are living in squalid conditions. They have nothing. And so they need to do what they can in order to survive, because the state has failed them at every single turn. It's all interconnected. Going back to what I mentioned about the color of law, everything about where you live, to how you engage with the educational system, to every single aspect of your life is covered by a system of extreme racial inequality. And there, of course, when we think about policing, there are many other important books that we need to be thinking about when we think about, for example, Black Lives Matter that's going on right now, police brutality. These two books, for example, Leslie McSpadden's Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil, The Life and Legacy and Love, of my son, Michael Brown, who was killed unjustly by the police. Then you have this book, Rest in Power, by Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, on the killing and the execution of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, who murdered him, regardless of what courts say. You begin to understand that there is a real palpable sense that this system, as it exists, as it is constructed, is an existential crisis for Black people in particular. That they are living every single day with the threat of police stops, with the threat of profiling, with the threat of traffic stops. If you look at Philando Castile's case or Sandra Bland's case, that being pulled over by the police is a terrifying experience. It's not something that is just simply like, oh, okay, I got stopped by the police, I just need to do what I can. Like, the trauma that Black people feel when they see those sirens behind their cars is real, because we've seen the videos. We know what happens when they get stopped in the street, like Eric Garner, like George Floyd. We know this is real, that they are facing a genuine crisis of how their lives are treated. But we have to unfortunately acknowledge that we have people in our own communities that help to reinforce these structures. And I think over the last few years, one of the most devastating books that I read is the next one on my list of 10, which is this one, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Forman Jr. Sorry, let me just hold it up for a second, Mom. I'll be honest and say this is one of the most devastating books that I read, because what James Forman Jr. does, and he's a lawyer who spends a lot of his time representing indigent Black people. What he describes right from the very beginning, he's setting the scene for us from the beginning of the book, that he's in a Washington court where the judge is Black, the prosecutor is Black, the bailiffs are Black, the police officers are Black, the defendant is Black, the defense lawyer is Black, the jury is Black. And yet, the sentence that is given is disproportionately excessive. And the question that he has for himself as somebody who's representing these young Black people is why? Why in this circumstance, when technically this is the peak of representation, that every single person in the room is Black, are harsher sentences sometimes being given out? And so he goes through the history of how privileged Black people were co-opted at stages to help cement the system of mass incarceration in the US. And that's why we need to be very, very, very careful about the way in which we as activists engage with the state. You hear of people calling on the state in order to deal with certain issues that they see within their community. But you have to understand, when you do that, there is an implication about the way in which our communities are then policed. And, even when he talks about, for example, policing in Chicago, where studies show that something like 28% of Black police officers had a view of Black people that was indistinguishable from the Ku Klux Klan. That we understand that when we talk about institutionalized and systemic and structural racism, that people of color can be just as complicit in that structure as anybody else, because it's the structure itself that is racist. It develops that racism, it nurtures it. So even if you have good intentions, even if you want the betterment of your society, when you verify and provide cover to that system and that structure, you help to cement its status. And it's such a profound book, and it's so well and meticulously researched and argued that, you know, for me it was definitely one of the standout picks. I've already been going on for a very, very long time, so I want to end as quickly as possible. There is this book, Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, which is the penultimate book on my list of 10. Bryan Stevenson, a wonderful, wonderful civil rights lawyer in America. He, you know, some of you will be familiar that there was a movie about this book that is out right now with Jamie Foxx and can't remember the other actors' names at the moment, but you know, for a start, he's such a wonderful lawyer. Again, going back to that documentary 13th by DeVraney on Netflix, he features prominently in that documentary. You know, he's speaking about the system of mass incarceration, but specifically, what he helps to show is the way in which Black people are disproportionately given death penalty sentences. And often, and he, you know, this book details an exoneration from the death penalty, often without due cause. You have projects like the Innocence Project that exist in America specifically because of how problematic the legal system and structure is when it comes to the death penalty in America. That, you know, rather than you know, kind of veering on the side of giving benefit of the doubt, that actually the way that the prosecutorial system is constructed is to try as hard as possible to attain that death penalty verdict. So it's a very moving, very, very moving case, beautifully written. Just Mercy, Bryan Stevenson, highly recommended. The last book I really want to recommend on my list of 10 is this one. It's called Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism by Safiya Noble. A very eye-opening book for me. I didn't really know much about how racist algorithms that we're interacting with on a daily basis can be. You don't really feel it necessarily because you don't see what's going on behind the scenes. But she does an incredible job of helping to unpick how the racism that exists within liberal society, it gets embedded within the very coding of the way that search engines are produced. And she doesn't just deal with search engines; she deals with much more than that. But really, the whole purpose of her book is to show that, look, when we talk about structural racism, we're literally talking about everything now. We're talking about even the tech industry and the way that tech is used in order to discriminate against people. That, like she gives us an example, that if you type in, or at least used to before her book came out, type in unprofessional hair, it would come up with images of Black women with perfectly amazing, you know, hair made up into different styles, whether it's you know, kind of a full afro or it's braided or whatever it might be. Nothing wrong at all with the way that they look, except the fact that they're Black, and that's how they choose to style their hair. But that, in a Google search function, that when you look for unprofessional hair, is what you get. So how does that happen? How does that occur? is because the people who are coding this stuff in the first place have certain biases that are embedded in their notion. She's fairly sure, I'm fairly sure there's not somebody kind of malevolently typing in, okay, you know, if somebody types in this search, then this is what should come up. No, it's already embedded in the way in which society sees itself, in which the way that the people who are involved in the coding see us, the way that they think of the world. And so when we think about, and I'm going to try and wrap up here so we can take a few questions before I conclude. But when we think about all of these books that I've mentioned today, and the reason why they're important is to get to that point to say that there is something a little unique, albeit not completely, because, you know, even here in the UK where I'm based, you know, all of this exists. But there is a specific experience in America that we have to acknowledge and we have to take into account because of how utterly harmful it is. And when you factor in an extremely militarized police on top of it, then you really start to see how damaging that can be. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take some before we conclude this session. I hope it was useful. I hope that you've come away with some interesting books to be able to look into to help improve all of our understanding of what this means. And of course, if you do read in the books that I mentioned, please do let me know, message me, tell me what you thought about them, because I'd be really interested to hear what you think as well. So yeah, please. I'm not sure where the questions are. Okay, here we go. I think I found them now. All right. Oh wow. Okay, I didn't realize there were all of these comments coming up. All right, I'm just going to quickly try and look through some of them. Somebody said, so upsetting when books aren't returned. I feel your pain. Yeah, I'm telling you, man, that's that's painful for me. There's a nice comment here. The autobiography of Malcolm X was extraordinary and changes your perception as well as the way you walk in life. Yeah, absolutely. All right, my colleague Marzen Beg, he said about the autobiography of Malcolm X. I bought my copy in 1992, read it a few times in UK, but came across it in Bagram and Guantanamo, where black US soldiers were reading it. I tried to tell them how far they were from Malcolm by invading Muslim lands. Many were disturbed by what they were doing. In 2014, I was arrested by the police who tried to prosecute me for terrorism. They seized my copy of Malcolm X and tried to use it to prove an extremist mindset. Well, you know, it tells you a lot about how the US see itself. Okay, so we've got a question. What was the book by Harris about how white liberals use civil rights movement to shirk real responsibility for their racism? That was Gian Theo Harris's book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History. I'll put it up again for Elisa. A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, Gian Theo Harris. What I really love about this book is the extent to which she focuses on Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King as kind of like two main protagonists for how that history has been abused. Because people, of course, they concentrate on Martin Luther King a lot, and rightly so for many reasons. But actually, it's Coretta Scott King who is the real driver of Martin Luther King's more radical opinions. So it was really her, you know, his wife, who helped convince him about the importance of taking a stance on the Vietnam War. You know, we know the famous phrase by Martin Luther King that, you know, he couldn't call out the violence of his own community until he called out the violence that the American military were perpetrating in Vietnam. You know, he called the American military or the American government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And so, you know, what she does is she helps us to situate Coretta Scott King's legacy. But also with Rosa Parks, she shows us that actually Rosa Parks wasn't somebody who just one day decided to sit on a bus, right? And, you know, as a matter of a random incident, she shows us actually that there were at least 2 other women who had done that before. But because of, you know, the way that kind of more liberal minded activists saw those 2 figures, well, you know, one, I think her father had been convicted of a crime, and the other one, I think she had a baby out of wedlock, but I can't remember exactly. That, you know, they were seen as being like, oh, well, they're not the ideal candidate for really rallying around, even though they had sat on the bus before Rosa Parks had. Rosa Parks, when she did it in a calculated way, which is taken away from her. You know, it's always presented as like it was just a moment of frustration. She sat down and that's what started this whole thing. No, it's much more calculated than that. And by not appreciating that, we take that agency away from that action. That Rosa Parks was embedded in a culture of activism. It wasn't just random. So yeah, it's an excellent book. I really enjoy it a lot. Somebody's mentioned, Rabina's mentioned Rene Eddo-Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Excellent book. Really much more about the UK, but of course it does deal with the whole idea of structural racism. Khalid Rahman, Malcolm X understood the mind and way of thinking of the oppressors. How did he understand the system so well? Through his reading in prison? Yeah, I mean, definitely his time in prison, of course, it's transformational for him. You know, he encounters the Nation of Islam for the first time. You know, they are speaking in a way in which he's never heard anyone speak, and with a certain level of dignity and a self-respect that was unknown amongst certain quarters at that time. And he really felt that. And part of that journey, of course, is the reading. It's such an important part of Malcolm's own transformation that he's now trying to really understand the world that he's living in. And it's an incredible thing for us to think about in terms of what books can do for us, how they can improve our thinking about anything that we're engaging with. Bilal Sheikh makes the point that I think to give context to racism against Black people in the US, you need to look at books regarding not only Black slavery, but also the genocide of American Indians or First Peoples. It paints an end-to-end story from the beginning to today. Absolutely. I definitely agree with that 100%. You know, even further back than that, the whole period of colonization, I think when you look at the tactics that are used in American policing today, you have to understand that American policing, and I'm actually reading a book right now called The End of Policing, which hopefully I'll do a review of as soon as I finish. But it's so fascinating to see that American policing is not seen as policing by consent. It's seen as counterinsurgency, and it takes its logic from counterinsurgency. That's why it's so militarized. And so that's why you cannot separate what empire was doing in India, in Egypt, in Malaya, in any of these places where colonized, in the whole of Africa, from the way in which communities are policed. Even Ireland, of course, Ireland's extremely important when we understand how policing takes place in America. So in order to understand any of these things, and of course, a huge part of that is how the first peoples of America were treated, how they were systematically killed. And that feeds very, very much into the system of modern day policing. Okay, Susan Marie suggests A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Excellent book, and I highly, highly recommend it. Definitely you should pick that up if you haven't read it yet. Okay, Khalid Rahman again, it's a good question. What are your thoughts on companies and sports teams and players are posting of Black Lives Matter on their feed and taking a knee? Do you think it's bandwagoning? How can we maintain the momentum and go a step further? any solidarity is good, but solidarity has to be consistent, and it can't just be a platitude. It can't just be performative. The actions that we take have to be risky. When it comes to complicity, and to unfortunately plug my own book here a little bit, in my own book, Virtue of Disobedience, there's a chapter where I describe liberal complicity and what I call the concentric circles of complicity. The people who are most affected by an injustice are the least complicit in that injustice, because they don't have the ability to do anything other than try and fight for their lives, to fight for their freedoms, right? And they have to do it from inside a racist structure. The people who are most complicit are the ones who have privilege, the ones who don't feel the violence of those policies and that legislation. And it's my contention, and that of many other activists who came before me, that they have the responsibility to take the most risks in terms of how they conduct their activism, whether it's financially, whether it's through their bodies, whatever the case might be. People who are not Black should be placing themselves between the police and Black protesters. That is what they should be doing right now. That is what, in America right now, real solidarity would look like. Because who is at most risk? We know that Black people are most at risk at these protests. We know that they're going to be overly criminalized and profiled. And so how do you show that solidarity? By especially when you are at least risk of the system of racial violence, is by taking those risks. So I think we'll post the full book list on the Cage account some way somehow. I hope this was useful for you all. I guess if there's one message I'd like you to take away from this, it's that the system of racial violence and structural racism, structural violence in America is so deeply embedded that we should never make comments like, well, why can't they just pull themselves up? Why can't they just, behave like everybody else? They've been trying. They've been trying for decades and decades and decades. But the system is so entrenched in its racism that you will constantly have moments like George Floyd until the system itself is changed. And the people who are involved in Black Lives Matter right now, the people who are involved in the protests on the streets, they are the ones who are saying, they're showing us that we've had enough, that our lives are literally on the line. And so for us to sit from further afield, those of us like me who can't even get into the United States, right, to pontificate about the justness of what they're doing, that needs to stop. What they need is our support to say, we will do better to understand what you're going through, but you also have our support, because what is happening to you at the most fundamental level is unjust. So I'm not really interested at all, I'll be honest with you, in people who are, going on and on about the looting. There is a serious injustice taking place of life, of people's lives being on the line. And to say that, okay, well, we're going to equate, kind of corporations and their interests with the life of a poor Black person, sorry, but, I'm not interested in that. So inshallah, I pray that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts this, that there is something useful that came out of this for you all. I hope that you'll write to me if you read any of the books, and that you'll recommend to me any books that I've missed that you feel are extremely important that I should be reading, and I'll definitely pick them up because I love reading. So jazakumullah khair for all of your time. I very much look forward to talking to you all again. Take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.